Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Annie, this is Stanley, and we're here to talk about books. So today's video is going to cover all of the books that I finished in March. But first of all, let's make some tea. Tea, glorious tea. 9. That'll be green, jasmine and pear. Excellent. I'm drinking an awful lot of black tea recently. A lot of black tea in the drawers at the moment, so it's nice to get something a little lighter, a little fresher, a little floral, a little bit fruity. Good old past me has already boiled the kettle. Green, pear and jasmine in my favourite teapot. Oh, excellent. So now that we've got our tea, let's get on to the books. So March was an interesting month because it fell between various of the reading challenges that I'm taking part in. And so I didn't really have a plan or an external set of prompts. So instead of just doing a mood reading month, which would have been weird but interesting, I created a complicated challenge for myself where I generated prompts from my robot TBR jar and then took them along to the library along with some others that are lingering around from other reading challenges that are ongoing, and tried to find books that fit the prompts. And it was really, really fun. And I read some books which I never would have read otherwise. And some of them were good books and some of them were not so good books, at least for me. So what we're actually starting with, though, is an audiobook that I was listening to at the start of the month, which is Playing with Fire by R.J. Blaine. And this one I came across because I was trying to complete the Become the Avatar Square for Herkyed, the hardest reading challenge you'll ever do, where you have to find books with the different elements in the title. And I'd already finished the square, but I was kind of intrigued by this one because it was described as a comedy, fantasy, romance with a body count, and it had a unicorn on the cover. So I thought, why not give it a try and see what happens? And I mean, there were aspects of it that I enjoyed, and there were other aspects of it that I didn't really enjoy. The accent that the narrator was putting on for the whole of the first person narrative, I found quite off-putting, if I'm honest. I'm a little bit hit and miss with accents, and yeah, this one didn't really work for me as the entire book, rather than it just being when characters were speaking. So that was a bit of a shame. It was very well read, don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising the narrator at all. And the accent was appropriate for the character. I just found it a little bit off-putting. The book was very, very silly. It's set in a kind of alternate modern world like ours, only where there's magic and various different types of substances that affect people. And there was an awful lot of goo. It was mostly the protagonist who works for the sort of magical CDC, going around and clearing up weird goo over and over again, which didn't end up being particularly interesting overall. And there was also romance, and I wasn't that keen on it. I came to the conclusion quite quickly that if the genders were reversed, the amount that the narrator was objectifying the love interest would have had me DNFing the book almost immediately. But somehow, because it was a female narrator and a male love interest, it was fine. But I mean, it still got a bit much and it didn't really work for me. So I ended up DNFing it, unfortunately. Which is a shame because there's like 15 in the series. So if I'd really loved it, I could have carried on listening to them for ages. But there you go. Sometimes these books just don't work out. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who would absolutely love this series. because well written, it was funny, just wasn't for me. The next up was one that I picked up from the library to fulfill the prompt of there being action or movement on the cover from the buzzword cover challenge for the month of March. And also, I originally picked it up, I think, for there being the in the title from my robot prompt TBR jar, but I ended up switching things around quite a lot, and this one ended up fulfilling the 3 or fewer words in the title, and that was The Foxwife by Yang Shi Chu, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly. I apologize. And this one also, I think, fulfills one of my TBR-a-thon prompts of being set in another country or culture. And it's mostly set in China, but also with sections in Japan. And it's set in the early 1900s, I think. And there's a split narrative between a fox spirit who is looking for the person who killed her child, and also a private detective who is looking for the same man for other reasons, because he might be connected to the death of a young woman. And it travels around different places. There's a lot about Chinese fox spirit mythology. I found it a bit slow to begin with, and the 2 separate narratives were a bit confusing because one of them was in the present tense and one of them was in the past tense, but they were taking place at the same time. So I found that a bit confusing. But once it became obvious how the stories connected and how they were going to come together, it really picked up, and I ended up really, really enjoying this. It was very well written. It was very immersive. One of the things that was interesting about it is that most of the chapters are super, super short, 3, 4, 5 pages. And that's normally a technique that's used in thrillers to increase the pace of the story. And in this one, it did the exact opposite, because it felt like we weren't getting anywhere, that very little could happen in that space of time. And then we were always switching back to the other narrative. And I was enjoying both narratives, which is good in this kind of book. But it just felt like it wasn't really getting anywhere, and it felt very slow. But I really enjoyed how it came together, and the ending was very emotive and really took me by surprise. I thought I knew where it was going, and then it wasn't. So that was really excellent, and I gave this one 4 stars. Next up is Friends Like These by Kimberly McCrate, and I picked this one from the library because it had these in the title, which fit the buzzword title challenge of this, that, these, or those in the title. And it also fulfilled my robot TBR jar prompt of a block capital title, which is quite often the way with thrillers. I'm very hit and miss with thrillers. They can go either way for me very easily. But this one was a pretty good one. There weren't very many likable characters. It was about a group of friends meeting up at a house in the country, supposedly for one of their bachelor parties, but actually so that they could have an intervention for one of the group who was a drug addict. And before the book started, there was a traffic accident, and there was one person who was definitely dead and another person who was missing, but it wasn't revealed which of the characters that either of those were for quite some time, and the story flicked back and forth between various different timelines. So there was the perspective of the police detective in the present, and then there were flashbacks to what had happened in the few days leading up to where it started. And then there were also flashbacks further back to when they were at university and things that happened there. So there were a lot of sort of secrets and mysteries to unravel from the beginning. And it kept me reading. I was intrigued. I liked the police detective. Though it did take me a little while to get into it because it was quite confusing with all the jumping around in time and with none of the other characters being remotely likable. But the main plot twist when it turned up did seem as if it came out of nowhere and was a bit annoying. But I liked the ultimate conclusion of what happened with the police detective at the end in particular. And yeah, it definitely kept me reading. It kept me intrigued. And it all kind of resolved in a reasonably good way in the end. 3.5 stars. Next up was another audiobook, which was The Measure by Nikki Erlich, which sets up the premise that at one point in the world, everybody wakes up to discover a box on their doorstep which contains a piece of string which tells them how long their life will be. And it extrapolates from there what might then happen. And yes, obviously, it's a completely ridiculous premise, but it's one of those books where you just have to go with that premise. And it went in some interesting directions and it asked some interesting questions. I thought the extrapolation of things that might happen on various global scales and also on much more individual scales was very well thought out. But for about the first 2/3 of it, it felt much more like an intellectual exercise, a kind of a thought experiment, than it did a story with characters to really follow. It kept introducing more and more and more viewpoint characters, and it would then give a whole chapter of their life up until the point the boxes arrived, and then their life since the boxes had arrived. So it just went over the same period of time over and over and over again, and it was an awful lot of background summary, so it was a lot more sort of individual character studies. But it did come together. All of the different plot threads did come together in the end, and it did take me by surprise in some places. It definitely got very emotive towards the end in a lot of ways. But I thought it was largely well done once it really came together, even though the epilogue did feel a bit like those text cards that you get at the end of films that are based on a true story, where it just goes, such and such person went on to do this, or this is what happened to such and such person. So I'm not sure it wholly worked as a novel, but I thought it was really interesting, and I'm giving it 3.5 stars. The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown was not on my original TBR from the library, but it replaced Girl Dinner by Olivia Blake, because when I went back to the library, I couldn't find that. I found all sorts of other Olivia Blake books, but not that one, so I couldn't get Girl Dinner, unfortunately. And I picked The Book of Doors instead, just randomly while I was in the library selecting my first reads for the month. And that was going to replace it in terms of the in the title. No, Girl Dinner doesn't have the in the title. Girl Dinner was READ from Lost in the Library, and it was going to replace, The Book of Doors was going to replace Girl Dinner for that, and I was also going to use it for the in the title because the Fox wife took over 3 or fewer words in the title, and I couldn't use that for The Book of Doors because it was 4. Okay, but it doesn't actually matter because I DNF'd The Book of Doors, so that was all irrelevant. I liked the premise of this. It's about a young woman who is given a book by a regular visitor to the bookshop where she works, and with The Book of Doors, any door becomes every door. So she can use it to travel to all sorts of different places. And of course, then there are various factions who are looking for the magic book and start hunting her down. And then there's someone who comes and says he knows all about it and can help her out and all of that. And I was really enjoying it originally. I liked the characters. I thought it was quite well written. Although there was quite a disconnect between the tone and the content, because it felt almost like a kid's book in the way the prose was quite simplistic, and the tone was quite light, but then it was actually pretty violent and pretty unpleasant and very dark in places. So there was a slight disconnect there. And then time travel got introduced, and characters started doing things that didn't seem to fit with how they'd been presented, and it just lost it for me about the halfway point, and I ended up giving up on it, unfortunately. And then we have The Lady and the Unicorn by Tracy Chevalier, and this came up as my TBR spin book for the month. Sarah Freshley over on Freshly Read Books has a challenge where you pick 12 books at the start of the year, and then she does a spin on a spinner wheel to figure out what order you're going to read them in. And this one came up as the shortest on my pile. And even though it was short, couldn't do it. It was another DNF, unfortunately. Very early on, the viewpoint character was just so repulsive in the way that he was treating and thinking about the female characters in the book. And I didn't want to spend time in his head. So unfortunately, this was another DNF. Next up was my favourite prompt selection for the month of March, which was What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama. And I picked this because I needed a book with a cat character or a cat on the cover, and I didn't want to add another physical book to my TBR or go back to the library and try and find one. So I picked this as an audiobook because What You Are Looking For Is in the Library fit very well with the way I picked the other books for the month. It's an anthology of short stories. So I think there's 5 stories in the book, but they are all linked. They're all set in the same section of Tokyo, and they all involve someone going to the community center library where the librarian gives them an unexpected book that then helps them decide how to move on into the future of their life in some way. And it did that quite well. There were all different narrators in the audiobook for each story. I liked some more than others. I liked some of the protagonists more than others as well. And I don't know, it was fine. It was a good listen. I enjoyed it, but the stories felt a bit nothingy. I liked aspects of them. They were all very kind of everyday stories. There's nothing wrong with that, and I often quite like that. And I really liked the way characters from one story would appear in the other stories and help out the protagonists of later stories than their ones. And I liked the progression of the characters that were in it all the way through. So the librarian herself and the library assistant were in all of them. But there was a weird thing about the librarian being a very large woman, and the reactions, particularly of the male protagonist to first seeing her, were really quite offensive. So I wasn't that keen on that. And as I said, it just it was fine, but it's not one that's going to stay with me. And I gave it 3 stars. Then we come to my top book of the month, The Venetian Heretic by Christian Cameron, which I picked because I needed a book with a pointed weapon on the cover for the Magical Readathon map prompt for the month, and I could not find one. It took me such a long time to find a book I wanted to read with a pointed weapon on the cover. But yeah, this turned out to be a really fantastic choice. It's set in 1650s Venice, and it's about an Englishman called Richard Hughes who works as a fencing master but gets embroiled in a missing persons case when he's asked by the Inquisition of the Holy Office, and also the Inquisition of the state, and also the Libertines, and also one of the local street gangs to investigate the disappearance of a particular woman. So he's ended up working for or doing favors for 4 completely different factions in the city of Venice that are normally at odds with each other, but all want the same thing. So it's quite complicated, but in a very fun way. And he's very engaging as a protagonist. He kind of reminded me of my husband Dave a lot, which was quite sweet. But I really liked the way it was narrated. It was very immersive. It was exciting. It was funny. I really liked all of the peripheral characters and the various different relationships that are forged. It's the first one in the series, so I'll definitely be looking out for more. Yeah, really, really good time. Really good time. And I might even pick this for our next family book club meeting, but I don't know. I haven't decided yet. 4.5 stars. Really excellent, fun read. Very glad I found this in the library, and I will definitely be looking up more by this author. And then I followed the hype, which is not something I do very often, but I had several friends tell me that I needed to watch Heated Rivalry, which is a TV show that came out earlier this year about a romance between 2 ice hockey players. And I did watch that and I did enjoy it. But I was much more interested in the subplot story between Scott and Kip than I was the main romance between Shane and Ilya. So when I realised that this was based on a book series and discovered that the first book is about Scott and Kip, I decided to give it a try. So Scott is the captain of the New York Admirals ice hockey team, and Kip is a barista in a smoothie shop, and they meet because Scott drops in after a run and has a smoothie and then has a really good game after several bad ones and thinks that he needs to keep going back and getting the smoothie because he's quite superstitious. Anyway, I listened to this as an audiobook, and that might have been a mistake because I had the characters very well cemented in my brain. The book's called Game Changer, by the way, and it's by Rachel Reed. I don't think I said that. And it is the first in the series. And Heated Rivalry, which is the one that the TV show is mostly based on, is number 2. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, audiobook. The characters were quite cemented in my brain from the TV show, and I could not imagine them in the book, the actors, because their characters are described very differently and they sound completely different. So I just couldn't imagine them in those roles. So they kind of became completely different characters, which is fine. But the accents, back to accents, it was rough. It was really rough. The narrator, I felt, made some quite odd choices in how some of the peripheral characters' voices sounded, not just in terms of accent, but more in terms of intonation. So one of the other players on the team came across as really kind of horrible, but he's not. And it was just the way he talked. He seemed very dismissive and quite condescending. And one of the other characters, a bartender at the gay bar that Kip frequents, came across as really, I don't know, weird and snarky and very smug. And he was a really nice character as well. So that was weird. And Kip's parents talked very slowly for some reason, and I don't know why. And Kip's accent, he was meant to have a Brooklyn accent, and it was sometimes Brooklyn, but it also kind of traveled around Boston, Minnesota, and Australia, as far as I could tell. So that was a bit off-putting, which was a shame. And I'm not against explicit sex in books. I'm not. But I do like them to be informed by the characters and have something about them that is unique to the characters or appropriate for the characters' personalities or what kind of phase they're at in their relationship or other things that have happened in the story. Otherwise, they just get a bit boring. And there wasn't enough of the characters in the sex scenes for me. And it was also a little bit disconcerting to be like picking up my medicine at the pharmacy or buying toilet paper in the supermarket and have men having very explicit sex in my ears. I'm not going to lie. So it was a little bit weird. But that said, I largely enjoyed it. It was sweet. It was fun. There were a few aspects that I wasn't so keen on. Some of the power dynamics were a little bit unsettling, and it did start to drag in the second half, but the ending was lovely, and I was glad to be able to see the whole arc of Scott and Kip's story played out and fill in all the gaps. I don't know if I'm going to carry on with the series because the next 2 are also narrated by the same audiobook narrator, and I wasn't keen on the way that he presented Ilya when Ilya turned up in this book. And obviously Ilya is going to be one of the main viewpoint characters in the second one. So I might give it a try. I might not. But overall, I gave it 3.5 stars, and it was a fun time. And last up is The Other Side of Happiness by Brock Bastian, which has a tagline of embracing a more fearless approach to living. I picked this up because I got the non-fiction prompt out of my Robot TBR jar, and this was the only non-fiction book I could find in the whole library that I wanted to read. Yeah, I'm not great with non-fiction. And it also eventually did replace Girl Dinner and The Book of Doors as having R, E, A, and D in the title and author names. I was expecting from the cover and from the tagline that this would be a fairly easy read self-help book, which might give me some insight into things that I might be able to do to stop being scared of everything all the time. And it wasn't. This is quite an academic book. It's very dense. It's very scientific. It's very intellectual, and it's definitely not a self-help book. It does have a kind of philosophy of life embedded in it, in terms of not trying to avoid pain, but it's mostly about the psychology of how human brains process pleasure and pain, how surviving adversity to a certain degree helps us be more resilient, and how sharing difficult situations and experiences with other people makes us more empathic, which was all very interesting. I don't think there was anything in here that was particularly new to me, but it was really interesting to see all of the data and all of the scientific studies that backed up the arguments that the author was trying to make. And I do agree with a lot of the stuff that he said. And it's always useful to be reminded of these kinds of things, because they generally run counter to how your brain instinctively reacts to stuff, and your learned behaviors over time, because it doesn't really match with the current societal trend of trying to avoid pain and increase comfort at all costs. So it was interesting from that point of view. And yeah, 3.5 stars. So that's all my March reading. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching. Please do like the video if you liked it, and subscribe if you want more content of me and Stanley talking about books. Drop me a comment if you've read any of these books. I think Game Changer is probably the one that people are most likely to have read, and not the random ones that I picked up off the local library shelves. But yeah, let me know what your top book for March was, and whether that was a surprise or not. And I will see you in another video very soon. Bye for now.